By the way, the whole movie being option thing, that's a prerequisite of rabbis in Los Angeles. If you don't have a book option for a movie, they don't renew your contract. So you shouldn't be impressed with that. I did not intend to start with a football story. But given that you had Terry Bradshaw, who canceled, and Boomer Esiason as his replacement, and that our honoree Maxine loves football, I thought I would tell you my only Jewish football story. It may be the only Jewish football story, but it's a good one. As some of you, I'm sure, know, the catalog of distinguished Jewish quarterbacks is very small. But there was a great Jewish quarterback. His name was Sid Luckman. Sure, applaud for Sid, why not? So here is a true and verified story from people who knew him about Sid Luckman. When he started playing, his parents were Eastern European immigrants. They didn't know from football. So he said to the coach, listen, my parents are going to come to the game, but they don't know what's going on, and they don't understand. I wonder, would you mind if they sat on the sidelines, so at least they'll have some sense of the flow of the game? And the coach said, sure, no problem. So his father and mother were sitting on the sidelines. He drops back to pass, and some linemen break through, and they begin to chase him. And he's scrambling down the sidelines, and the Luckmans see their boy being pursued by large people who are obviously intent on doing him harm. And his mother leaps to her feet and says, Sid, give him the ball, I'll buy you another one. Now, I tell you that story because we know that story in our DNA. It's the immigrant who doesn't understand the rules of the new culture. It's where, go back far enough, we all came from, and some of us not very far. But here is the irony for American Jews in that story. People of the generation of Luckman and his parents were immigrants to America, but they were natives to Judaism. My grandfather, who was not a particularly religious man, when they needed a tenth for a minyan, they called him, and of course he went, because he was a native to Judaism. Today, it's just the reverse. There isn't anybody in this room I need to explain football to. But there are a lot of people who wouldn't feel comfortable in a minyan. We've become natives to our culture and immigrants to our religion. And one of the things that you do, whether you know it or not, because I looked at the distribution of funds, is you support Jewish education, which is a way of making people natives again. That's what Jewish education is. It's a way of teaching our children our language. And by our language, I don't only mean Hebrew, I mean the Jewish language. So that they can go into a synagogue anywhere in the world and they won't feel like Luckman's parents at the football game. And among the things that you do, that is by far not the least important. But that wasn't where I was going to start. I only did that because of the whole Esiason and Bradshaw thing. Instead, I was going to start by telling you the story of the rabbi and the doctor. So this doctor was talking to his rabbi, and he said to him, you know, Rabbi, sometimes when a patient comes to me and I know they can't pay, I will write the prescription for them and even subvent the prescription so that they don't have to pay out of their own pocket. The rabbi thinks for a minute, he goes, I do that. And the doctor says, well, sometimes I will send them to other consulting physicians and I'll make sure that the other consulting physician doesn't pay them if I know that they're indigent and they really can't afford it. The rabbi thinks, he goes, I do that. And now the doctor is getting increasingly frustrated. He says, well, I even do surgery at times, and I make sure that they're not charged anything over and above their insurance so that they really don't have to pay for the surgery. The rabbi thinks for a minute. He goes, yep, I do that. The doctor says, Rabbi, with all due respect, you don't have patients, you don't refer to other doctors, and you certainly don't do surgery. And the rabbi said, oh, no, I meant I say good things about myself too. So I'm going to say good things about us, about what you do, but I hope and expect that actually I'm going to say it in a way that maybe you haven't thought about it before. Because sometimes, strange as it sounds, we get trapped in certain bubbles of self-esteem just like we get trapped in certain bubbles of self-blame. And I want you to think about your mission the same but differently. And I'm going to start with the reality that every institution, and by every institution I mean synagogues, but also, I suppose, federations, suffers from the same complaints. The first thing to tell you what a friend of mine said, it was a brilliant line, which I will steal, but now you may as well. He said, someone came up to him and said, you know, Rabbi, the reason I don't go to the synagogue is because there are so many hypocrites there. My friend said, don't worry, there's always room for one more. One of the things that we don't acknowledge when people complain about the politics involved in Jewish life is, let me tell you what someone means when they say, I don't want to be involved because there are too many politics. What they mean is, I didn't get my way. Nobody ever gets their way and says, you know what, there were too many politics. Never happened in the history of the world. Too much politics means other people felt differently than I do, and they won. So part of what I want to tell you is that the people who stay are the people who realize that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but the mission is bigger than you. And the people who leave don't know that. Since you're here, you're the people who stay. Day after day and year after year, through sometimes when you get your way and sometimes when you don't get your way. And remember, C.S. Lewis had a wonderful definition of humility. He said, humility isn't thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less. And if you believe in the mission of the Federation, then the fact that you didn't get your way today actually doesn't matter. Because what you do is bigger than any of us. And sometimes we don't realize how unique it is to have this in the Jewish world. Because other communities don't have this. I'll give you one example. I'm saving a story about it for a few minutes from now, really only a few minutes, don't worry. But let me just give you one example. I have a non-Jewish friend who had a brain tumor in Los Angeles. And I've had both a brain tumor and lymphoma. I've had all sorts of, let me tell you about my medical problems. We're all Jews. We'll play mahjong and I'll tell you about my medical problems. But so she called me and she said, I need a referral for a doctor rather, who can help treat me. So I gave her a referral. Months later, she called me and she said, basically, God, you Jews. She said, like, once you're in the network, it's amazing. She's English Catholic. She said, we have nothing like this. But all of a sudden I was taken care of and everybody knew another doctor, and of course always the best doctor, because we only know the best, the top specialist in whatever it is. But you realize how unique this is. When you talk about that we should take care of one another, and our only question is not whether it's a legitimate value and it's a real value, it's just, well, do I really want to take the trouble to do it? But that already is miles ahead of most communities. You know, you mentioned Sharansky and Maxime walked across the bridge with him. Let me tell you something about Sharansky in the beginning of his first book. He says the following. I always talk about this when people say the day schools are parochial. It drives me crazy when people call them parochial schools. There is nothing less parochial than being Jewish. Nothing. Above the UN, the most universal institution in the world, whether you like it or not, what is there? A quote from Isaiah. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, from Isaiah. On the Liberty Bell, as I know, growing up in Philadelphia, there's a quote from Leviticus. When the world wants to express itself universally, it turns to the Jewish people. When you ask Jews, they say that's parochial. So Sharansky says the following. He says, there were Jews in the Soviet Union who thought being Jewish was parochial. They wanted to save the world. They ended up being communists and enslaving half of the world. Then there were Jews who believed in being Jewish. They became refuseniks and ended up liberating the Soviet Union. And he draws the analogy that he took from the writer Cynthia Ozick. She said, the shofar has a narrow end and a broad end. If you start off by blowing in the broad end, you get nothing. But if you start off by blowing in the narrow end, you get a sound that everyone can hear. By saving Jews, you're not just saving Jews. It's not a parochial mission. Granted, federations all over this country, and certainly in Metro West, you help other people as well. But by helping Jews, don't think you're only helping Jews. You are bringing the original universalist tradition to life in the world. And you know, and I know, that if you want to support almost any charity in the world, the best thing to do is to raise another generation of Jews. You want to support the symphony? Send a kid to day school. Oh, look at all of you. When someone gets up in front of a group of Jews, what do they always say? I know you give to the symphony, I know you give to the opera, I know you give to the theater, I know you give to general charities. That's taken for granted. But don't think that that doesn't exist in the soil of Jewish culture. It does. That's why you do it. Even if you're not immediately aware of it, believe me, all those thousands of years of training come to fruition in part with our sense of responsibility not only to the Jewish people but to the community. And federation is the best exemplar, the paradigm of what it is to take care beyond yourself. You're never going to meet 99% of the people who benefit from what you do. But that is the purest kind of giving. Because you're actually not doing it so that someone will come to you one day and say to you, you did this for me and you did this for me, aren't you wonderful? But that makes you more wonderful. It does. That's the reality of it. Now, it is also true that if you're, I don't know most of you, some of you I know, I don't know most of you, but if you're sitting in this room right now, you are luckier than 99.9% of all the human beings who ever lived. No question about it. If you've never gone hungry, really hungry, if you lived after antibiotics and modern medicine and indoor plumbing, you are unbelievably fortunate. And by the way, as far as Jews are concerned, you're luckier than 99.99999% of Jews who ever lived. But you shouldn't feel guilty. Nobody should feel guilty for good fortune. You should feel lucky and responsible. Because we who are given so much, could just as easily have been born in another time or another place. We could have been born in a relocation camp in the Sudan. And then we wouldn't be so lucky. So we have an obligation to do something for people who are. Let me tell you, I have 3 stories stacked up, just like at Newark. But they're all very short, and I'll close with the third. Don't get too excited. They're not that short, but they're short. The first one actually is not specifically about federation, but it tells you, this is like, I think of this as the essence of the Jewish spirit. There's a woman in our community named Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and together with Harold Schulweis, they created something called Jewish World Watch. So this Beverly Hills lawyer, who's very successful and very wealthy and grew up in a family, her father was president of my shul and all of that, she goes off to the Congo and the Sudan, in like dangerous places, in refugee camps, and she tends to people. And she brings them solar cookers and all that stuff. So a couple of years ago, I invited her to speak on Yom Kippur about what she does. And she told the following story. She went to a tent, a medical tent for women who had been abused in the most horrific ways that I won't repeat, but you can imagine, over years. And they were treating them, and they were giving them food and solar cookers and showing them how to use them. And one of the women turns to her and says, "What are you doing here?" And she realized, she said, couldn't say I'm Jewish, because she doesn't know what Jewish is. So this is what she said. She said, "I'm a member of an ancient tribe. And in my tribe, we've been taught for thousands of years that every person is in the image of God. And that's why I'm here." So if you asked me, why are you here? I'd give the exact same answer. Even though you might not think so, you might think you have different motivations, but that's your motivation. Not that you might, some of you would put it in that language and some of you wouldn't, but you believe in the sanctity of the human being. And that human beings deserve to be saved, and they deserve to be educated, and that you have the means to do that, and you're right. So let me tell you a story about Federation from Los Angeles. I know you may think of Los Angeles as like a land bereft, but really it's not. Come visit us. We have kosher restaurants, everything. So it's a little bereft. Okay, but nonetheless, if you go to Los Angeles, the Federation is in one building. It's 6505 Wilshire. It's the Federation. And when I first came there, decades ago, I heard the following story and spoke to the Federation president involved. What happened was, one night, in the middle of the night, a call came through to the switchboard of the Federation. And the switchboard operator answered it, and on the other end was a little girl with an accent. And she said, "My father fell down and he can't get up. What do I do?" So the switchboard operator did what she was told to do in an emergency. It said, "Call 911, which she did, and then it said, "and then call Federation president." It's an emergency to Federation. So she called the Federation president. So the Federation president got out of bed in the middle of the night, went to the hospital, and sat with the little girl while her father, who had had a heart attack and eventually was okay, she sat there with her until, well, they did whatever they did. And then at some point, she turns to the little girl and she says, "Why did you call the Federation?" And the girl said, "Well, we're Russian Jews, and we've only been here for a few months, and we don't know anyone. And when we first came, my father wrote a phone number, and he scotch-taped it to the refrigerator. And he said, if anything bad ever happens, this is the Jewish building. They'll help you." But that's who you are. That's why you're here. You're the Jewish building. And you help. And that is an incredibly rare commodity in this world. We tend, like everything we're familiar with, to take it for granted. But the vast majority of people don't work that way. It is a beautiful and a wonderful thing. And it's a sacred thing. Believe me, I know it doesn't feel this way, but sacred work in this world happens in committee meetings. It does. Because you think what sacred work only happens when you're at a soup kitchen? No, it's when you say, you know what, we're going to give this money to this organization because it needs it. And we're going to allocate it this way. That's sacred work. Nothing less than that. And the people who go day after day after day, they know this in their bones, even if they don't come home and the kids say, "Where were you again tonight, Mom?" And they don't say, "I was at sacred work." But that's what it is. And that's why we do it. And that's what it means. And those of you, by the way, who are the spouses or the children of people who do it, You have to know that too. That even though the chain of cause and effect may be beyond what you can immediately see, in the end, the effect of all those committee meetings is to save lives, to educate Jews, to continue a culture, to do exactly what you think of as the holiest work in this world. Now I'm going to take a point of personal privilege because I'm going to finish with a different story that also illustrates what you do, but I'm going to tell you this story for a specific reason, which is some of you knew my father, who was a rabbi in Philadelphia for many years, Gerald Wolpe, who was at Har Zion, and because his yortzeit was just this past day, he died 7 years ago, I want to end with a story that he told me, because after all, he was my father and my teacher, and especially on the day of his yortzeit when I'm speaking in front of a group of Jews from almost our hometown, I ought to quote him. So this is what he told me. He remembers, as some of you do, when Israel was founded. And when it was founded, there was going to be a huge rally in Madison Square Garden. So along with the other rabbinical students, because he was in rabbinical school at the time, he went with several friends and they slept overnight. Right? People do that now for rock concerts, but they did it for the founding of the State of Israel. Not that there's been a decline or anything, I'm just saying. They slept overnight in order to get a good seat tomorrow to the announcement of the founding of the state. And right behind them in line, staying overnight, was an elderly survivor. And they were worried about him. First, they sleep overnight, and then there were going to be thousands of people rushing into the arena all at once. But when they opened the doors, everybody went rushing in. And my father said he and his friends got a seat right near the front, and they looked behind them, and there was the guy. And so my father turned around and said to him, "We were really worried about you. How did you make it down here?" And the man said, "I made it here because I wasn't running alone." All the people that he lost, they were all with him. All the people who never got to see the state, he was running for them. You can't be a Jew without being haunted by history. You can't. And you know all the people in our history that didn't get this. They never got the chance to sit at a nice dinner in a peaceful place and think about how it is that they could give of their tremendous resources to help other Jews. But when you do this, you're not doing it alone. They're here. Somehow, they know. And they're proud that people still care enough about who they were and how they lived, and sometimes, yes, how they died, that you want to see what they believed in, what they cared about, what they loved, and what they lived for continue. So really, I'm not being funny or facetious when I tell you that what you do is sacred, nothing less. And even if you don't feel it every day, and even if you don't feel it every minute, hold on to that image that there are people from our past looking over your shoulder, grateful that you haven't let go and you haven't given up, and you still care, and you still give, and you still fight, and you still love. Thank you.